Easy in the Harness: Stories, Solutions, and Strategies for Safe, Satisfying Driving. This podcast is all about working animals in harness, from agriculture to pleasure driving to performance driving at the international level. Learn about what driving is, training tips, history, and more with each episode. I am your host, Corey E.R. Trout of CERT Horsemanship. So this episode is basically a about me episode. It's the why you should bother listening to me and believe I actually know what I'm talking about episode. It is the how I got to this point episode. So it's not going to be as scripted as some of the other ones are, and we're just going to kind of go through it. So first off, I'm going to go ahead and just list my plain Jane credentials here. I am certified through the American Riding Instructors Association. I got my initial certification in 2010 in recreational riding and in dressage level 2. I then got recertified in 2014, level 2, also reconfirming my recreational riding, dressage, and then also I did the driving level 2 certification. In 2024, I became certified through the Carriage Association of America Level 1, and I have plans to continue forward with those certifications. And I also have an Associate's in Applied Sciences in Equine Science, and it doesn't necessarily factor into the driving, but I have my BFA in Art Education. But that's also, everything that's on the Patreon, all my illustrations and stuff for articles, that's all me. I've illustrated those. So anyway, how did I get into driving? And this is something that I've told countless students and clients. I got into driving the same way that I know lots of people get into driving. We bought this Belgian mare. Her name was Ruby. She was 6 or 7 years old at the time. We didn't have a set date on her. She wasn't registered. She was a former Amish horse, broke to ride and drive, and we bought her for my husband. He was following me into horses, and he wanted a big, stout horse, and Ruby was it. She was about 16'2", somewhere around 1,700 pounds. Good, stout, farm-style Amish draft horse. And she was broke to ride and she was broke to drive. So we thought, oh, hey, let's try this out. She's broke to do it. Let's go for it. So we bought this inexpensive leather harness. The company used to be called Ron's Harness Shop, and then it was sold and became Rose Hill Harness, and now it's completely defunct. But it was actually a pretty good harness for under $300. I don't think you can get something like it nowadays and have it actually hold together for you, but we were very lucky in the harness that we got. It was surprisingly well made for the cost. And then we went to the now defunct Grumpy Dave's Draft Horse and Mule auction that used to be in Cottonwood, Arizona, and I think they also had one in Show Low. But anyways, they had 2 a year. And we were in the one in Cottonwood, and we bought a Meadowbrook cart. And I have since come to view Meadowbrook carts as a sort of driving rite of passage, and I'll do a whole episode on that eventually. But so we bought this cart. We had a harness. We put it on her. We hooked it up. I just left her in the open bridle, long lined her with the cart attached, felt like, okay, she's good, and hopped in, and away we went. And at that point, I'm like, okay, I need to learn how to do this better, because we just kind of guessed on everything. I had like 1 or 2 lessons from a friend of my mom's who also happened to drive, and I got the feeling that there was a lot more to this than what I already knew. So I got in touch with our local driving and carriage society and found somebody miraculously within 6 miles of me that was teaching driving lessons. So I worked with Michelle Goss for 3 or I got to think about that, because we got Ruby in 2006. had Tristan in 2011. She was working with me with Z in 2014, so I did lessons with her for, I think, 6 years off and on at least, driving. And during that time, I started my first personal horse and harness, and I got my first actual driving client, which was Bud the Halflinger. I think I've mentioned him before, either whether it's in the podcast or in different posts and other content I've made, but Bud was my first official driving client. He was a 12-year-old halflinger. He's 25 now. Started working with him in 2012, and he was a little bit of a piece of work. He was sold to them as being able to ride and drive, and no, he was sold to them just as a driving horse, sorry. And we had hooked him up to their cart, and their turnout went all right, and we took him out on the road. We had her husband on the ground with us just in case, which was a smart thing. And we're going down the road, and we're like, there was a puddle of water like 80 feet out, and the horse saw it, and he's like, oh heck no, and he starts spinning to go home. And so we ended up having her husband snap the lead rope back on him and help guide us back home. And I spent another year or so long lining him and working with the tire with him, long lining and pulling a tire all around their neighborhood to get him to the point where he was no longer spinning and sucking back, because that was the worst thing he was doing. He would hit a point where he didn't want to go, and he would go backwards and sideways, which is one of the worst things a horse can do in a vehicle. And it took a long time to get him to the point where he would go past things that he wasn't sure about, or at least stop and stare. And they've been driving him for 12 years now, and he's the best driving horse for them. And from there, I got a couple more different people I was working with horses for driving. And my first full-time, I was able to take a horse in for full training. That was in 2000. I got to think about this. It was, I got to think really hard about this. 2015, probably 2016 or 17. I got in this Gypsy Vandermeer for full driving training. I had finally gotten to the point where I had space to take in a training horse and kind of put my shingle out. And this lady was looking for somebody to get her Gypsy Vandermeer started in driving. And she had 2 or 3 people, or I think 2 other people out to kind of do an evaluation on the mare. I went out, did the evaluation, and she decided that I was the best fit for them, and I got her mare started to drive, and I actually worked with her a couple of times over the last several years, and her owner's since become a good friend of mine. But Cree, the Gypsy Vandermeer, was the first horse that wasn't mine that I took start to finish driving as a full-time training horse. And from there, it's kind of snowballed. I've had her in training. I've had dozens of other horses since then. A lot of them have been Gypsy Vanners. I guess you work with one and other people realize, oh, you work with this breed, and you keep getting more of the same. But I've worked with everything from miniature horses to full-size drafts, Vanners, Frisians, Welshes, a few donkeys. I haven't had a mule that I've taken from start to finish yet, but I did have the miniature cow Bess that I fully broke to drive, and that was a fun one a couple years ago. So a lot of this has been, so I had the foundation of learning from Michelle initially. I went through the certification process for the American Riding Instructors Association. More recently, I went through the Carriage Association of America's deal, and I've just lots of reading, lots of videos. I forgot to mention. So I also went to there was a place somewhat nearby. It was about hour or so drive, and they did an annual draft horse clinic basically, and it was 2 days. They had this Amish guy come out. His name was Daniel Stolfitz, I believe. Anyways, he would come out every year and they would put on this driving clinic. They'd take out their horses that had been off all winter, clean them up, and do 2 days of working with plows, cultivators, forecarts, wagons. They had multiple teams going at a time and occasionally a single horse too. And it was a ton of fun. Learned a lot through those. The first year I went, I remember I went because I knew I knew some things, but I wanted to just kind of absorb everything. So I went there and I tried to keep my mouth shut as much as I could. And it took probably maybe an hour and a half in before Daniel kind of pegged me. You know what you're doing. And nicknamed me teacher for the rest of the clinic. And so, but learned a lot from him on the more practical kind of agricultural draft side of driving. And it's two different modes. You know, you have the carriage driving, which is either the pleasure driving around your neighborhood or the more performance style driving like in the CDEs and stuff. And that's its kind of own thing. And then you have the practical agricultural draft horse style driving. And they're the same, but they're different at the same time. One of the things I found really interesting was working with some of these teams. And these are horses that have just done draft style work. They haven't really been worked as pleasure horses. They use them to hay their fields, they use them to plow, etc. and so forth. They're not going around in a ring or anything like that, or doing a dressage test. So what I found really interesting during one of the clinics, I had this team that I was driving, and they tended to drift out to the outside. And I'm like, well, I know how to fix that. I don't know if they know how to respond to it. And it's just, aim the nose, close the outside rein, and sure enough, the horses came through the turn. And it offered me space to play with a bunch of different horses and see that, proper use of your aids works regardless of the horse's prior training, because the reason it's quote unquote proper is because it works with the horse's natural tendencies. So I'm not quite this warned you at the start, this is going to be a little bit of a rambly one. It's not very well scripted. I've kind of reached most of my points here, and now it's just stories. So anyways, some of the books and videos that I found really useful as I was going through, the Carriage Driving book by Heike and Sarah Blanchard. That one has 2 or 3 different iterations of it now, versions. And that was one of the books that was on the American Riding Instructors Association exam that was recommended reading. That one was really good. It gave me the idea of the difference between basically the fore and the hindquarters of the horse. So if you think about it, the horse's body, when you look at the forequarters, they're built kind of like a pillar. So the forequarters, when the horse is standing still, or in normal movement, they tend to carry about 60% of their weight in the forehand and only 40% behind. Well, that's because the forequarters are designed to carry more weight. They're built like a pillar. The hindquarters have more angles to them, and they're designed for dynamic propulsion. So this was one of the big takeaways from the carriage driving book, was the front end is designed for stationary support, whereas the hind end is designed for dynamic propulsion. So if you want your horse to carry itself, if you want it to move in an athletic manner, you got to shift that weight to the hind end. The carriage driving book covers a lot of things. It goes, basic harnesses all the way through to, training, dressage, pairs, etc. and so forth. Another one that I gleaned a lot from was Long Reining to Break Horses to Harness, Training the Safe Way by Heinrich, Freiherr von Senden. And that one had a lot of influence, how he goes through and teaches a horse how to drag a tire, breaking cart, all, from start to finish. That one had a good amount of influence on me. and I've referred back to it multiple times. The breakaways and stuff that he has also was very helpful, and how he often required multiple people during the stages of driving, which I had to adapt because I'm often alone when I'm training horses. But he had a lot of good things in there. The other super important one was what it was exactly the title. Oh, Train Your Horse to Drive by Clay Maier. That was a DVD series. Clay Maier used to have a grouping of four different DVDs that he had. He had the Train Your Horse to Drive, Introduction to Long Reins, which is actually a really good one to do before you get to the Train Your Horse to Drive one. Then he had Advanced Long Reining, which included stuff like, higher level dressage movements like piaffe and passage on the long reins. And then he had Tandem Riding, which is kind of good if you're thinking about doing tandem driving and how to build your horses up to that. But he had, these series of DVDs. He had he's where I got the idea for the rope traces from, and the quick release setup and all that. He worked with Meredith Cummins Rousseau, the MCR whips owner, and she's the one that made the whips, made the rope traces, made the quick release snaps. I've since found people local to me that could build at least the rope traces and the quick release, but she's still my go-to for whips. But anyways, so Clay Maier, that was Claymaier. His driving training series had a lot of influence on how I train horses to drive now. I took a lot of what he did and also added to it. Another good book was Driving Horses by Steve Bowers and Marlen Steward. That has a lot of good information in it, also about rein handling and so forth. His son Nate Bowers was with the Parelli horsemanship group for a bit. They put out a driving training series. It was 3 parts, 6 different DVDs. There was some good information in there, but I wasn't as fond of it as the Clay Maier. Even though Clay Maier's was just 2 DVDs, I found there was a lot more useful things in that versus the Nate Bowers one. The problem I had with the Nate Bowers one is that he pretty much did everything with his already trained horse, and we didn't get to see a young novice horse experiencing all these things, so you don't have a good feel of how to troubleshoot stuff. Whereas on Clay Maier's DVD, it was very much you followed a single young horse all the way through the training stages. So you saw a couple little moments of, oh, whoops, we need to go back and try again and fix this, and this is how we work through it. Let's see, some other ones. Doris Ganton, she had both a DVD and a book, Breaking and Training the Driving Horse. I found it informative in some ways, but it was released in 1984, so it is very dated. It's still decent information, but it wouldn't be my go-to. If you can get a hold of the Clay Maier Train Your Horse to Drive one, that would be the one I would go for. Another good one is The Essential Guide to Carriage Driving by Robin Cuffey and Jane Allison Winkle. They also have a DVD that was put out by Rural Heritage in 2007, and that's kind of a good overall introduction to driving. Understanding Harness by Barb. I guess this is also kind of a book recommendation podcast. So Understanding Harness by Barb Lee, that's a good one. That's put out by the Carriage Association of America. The Rural Heritage actually has several good DVDs about driving. They've got, as I said, the Essential Guide to Carriage Driving one. They have the Driving Draft Horses, Harnessing Work Horses, and a few others that I can't remember off the top of my head. So anyway, so those were some of the influences. Those are some where I got some of my knowledge from, and of course the first-hand experience working with my own horses, working with client horses, and slowly building the process that I have now in training driving horses. And that process has developed over the course of years now, over the course of working with a lot of different horses, mules, donkeys, and the cow. And so that's how I've gotten here today with what I do. And the reason I got into this podcasting thing is because I saw that there was a need for it, I think. There's not really much out there in the audio world talking about driving. There used to be the driving show on the Horse Radio Network that they that lasted several seasons, but they no longer have that available. You can go back and listen through the back catalog on the Horse Radio Network, but the downside is they had some good stuff on there, but a lot of it was also kind of updates and news kind of in the carriage driving community, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does date some of the episodes. So the other driving associated podcast that I'm aware of is called the Classic Series Redrive, and that's pretty much geared towards the draft horse community, specifically the draft show community. They have had a bunch of really interesting things, and it's a lot of stories about how people got to where they are and so forth. And one of the cool ones this last year was they had Chester Weber on there. I didn't realize that he actually drove a 6-up of Clydesdales for a while before he got heavy into the CDE stuff. So that was fun to learn. There is another carriage driving podcast, but I think it's pretty much regional and you can only get it on the website. It was, what was it called? Carriage Talk. Anyways, I found it the other day. I'm like, oh, hey, there's another one, but I couldn't find it on any of the podcasters. It's just on the website for a specific carriage driving group in the UK, I believe. So that was a little disappointing that it wasn't available through any of the podcasters. So, and that's kind of how I came into the driving thing. It was, we had this horse. Why not? This is another thing we can do with them. And as I gained more knowledge, it's like, okay, well, I want to train my other horses to drive. And then, hey, I have this skill. Why not use it? And started teaching other people, other horses. And it's kind of just spiraled out into what it is now. I would say I started out just as a riding instructor. And at this point, I'd say close to 50% of my business is the driving. And when it comes to training horses, the horses that I have in full training, which is pretty much only one at a time, that's like 80% driving. I hardly ever get a riding horse in for training. It's almost all driving. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of background on where I came from and how I got here. Any questions, feel free to comment or email me at easyintheharness@gmail.com. Oh, I guess one might ask why I didn't do this episode first and, give everybody kind of an intro to who I am and what I do, but I felt like it was more important to get some of the informational stuff out first. I really wanted to have that first episode be these are all of your resources because I wish I had that when I first started. I wish I had all these resources and all this knowledge right from the get-go and an easy place to access it. So I wanted to get the resources out first and then kind of break down the different types of driving and do a little bit of training stuff and then talk about myself, because this isn't a podcast about me. It's about driving. So I know people are curious about how I came to this point, and hopefully that fills in some of the questions, but I am happy to answer questions and go from there. So I hope you all found this entertaining and informative. I hope you enjoyed this and learned something new. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at easyintheharness@gmail.com. If you wish to support this podcast and other educational content, please go to our Patreon at patreon.com/certhorsemanship. That's CERT horsemanship. It will also be linked in the show notes. Being a supporting member gives you early access to the podcast episodes and transcripts. Higher levels of support give you access to videos, diagrams, and more that I have to offer, covering subjects from harness fit and function, vehicle selection, maintenance, and training your horse to drive, as well as more. This episode was produced by Amaris Saldate. And remember, you have freedom when you are easy in your harness.